Well, I think that, well, perhaps I'll just begin by thanking Canning House, thanking the Foreign Office for inviting us along. I think it's very encouraging, I mean, potentially encouraging, to see the business community beginning to take a great deal more interest in Latin America. These things are cyclical to a certain extent, and indeed, from an academic point of view, it was in the late 1960s when the sort of last bout of sort of Latino enthusiasm sort of took place within the business world, that the Latin American centers, which were centers for multidisciplinary Latin for study of the region, were established. Now these have had their ups and downs, but many of them are still there. I still work in one, so I'm pleased to hope that, I think that it'd be great if this business interest in Latin America germinates through into a more greater media interest in Latin America. We seem to be very low, apart with great notable exceptions to The Economist. The level of media coverage on Latin America is pretty lamentable in this country. But I hope that this will all form part of a virtuous circle towards greater engagement with the region, including in the academic world. I've been asked to talk about elections and institutions, and I'm fortunate that, in a sense, from where Mike left off, I can sort of seamlessly take on. I was worried that we were going to end up saying much the same things, but I think that what I want to do now is to look at how institutions work in Latin America, their strengths and weaknesses, and provide some sort of ideas, many of which are already in practice, as to how to strengthen those institutions. And I divide my talk into two bits. One is, I'm supposed to be talking about elections, so looking at democratic institutions and how they work in the region. And the second will be looking at, which I suspect will be more interest to most of you here, the institutions as they affect investors. One of the things that I think that characterizes a lot of academic work on Latin America is sort of one tends to err on the side of pessimism. It's always easier to be pessimistic than to be optimistic. But I think that we need to look at the moment at Latin America and its institutions in a global comparative way. And it seems to me that if we look around ourselves, around our contemporary world, if we look at places like Iraq and Libya and Afghanistan, we get the measure of just how developed Latin American institutions are compared with some other parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa as well. These are institutions which in many cases have a long historical development. They are not new. So I think that this is something that it's important to bear in mind. Indeed, I think it's worthwhile striking a certain note of humility with regard to Western European institutions. We see a certain amount of institutional disarray going on at this very moment. Maybe it'll all work out well, but this is certainly points to certain institutional defects, particularly within organizations like the European Union. And secondly, I think we need to look at institutions within Latin America itself. There is, of course, a huge difference between levels of institutional development in some countries as compared with others. If we look at the most developed parts of Latin America, we look at Mexico, we look at Brazil, we see a level of institutional development which is lacking in other parts of the region, in Central America, in some of the Andean countries, countries like Paraguay, for example, which have a much less developed set of institutions. So it seems to me that we need to bear that in mind, and also, of course, the difference between the existence of institutions within countries themselves, between often capital cities and major urban centers and large parts of the interior of various countries, where in many cases institutions are scarce on the ground and in some cases almost non-existent. So I think that these are things that we need to try and at least bear in mind when we're talking about institutional development. Now, turning to democratic institutions, it goes without saying that Latin America, with possible exception of Cuba, is now largely democratic in the way it is governed. Elections are held regularly, reasonably fairly, though money obviously still influences electoral outcomes, though Latin America is no different to other parts of the world, in some other parts of the world in that respect. And the results of elections are largely respected. Therefore, the region, I think, ticks the boxes of the minimal descriptions of democracy, which are there in some of the political science literature. Also, there are no veto powers outside from outside groups. Military coups are no longer a threat, although possibly the recent history of Honduras leads us to believe that the processes of democratization are not necessarily a one-way street, and that one can have reverses. And degrees of consolidation, of course, vary. And I mean, if one looks around us, we have two elections taking place in the very near future, in Nicaragua and in Guatemala, both of which raise certain questions about the electoral institutions and how they work in those countries. But perhaps the picture isn't quite as bright as this when we ask ordinary people what they think about governments, institutions, and how they work, and even the nature of democracy itself. Now, I've not had the chance to look at the latest Latino Barometer surveys, but these do point over the years, have pointed to some of the deficits, if you like, in terms of the way people view the institutions that govern them. The results of the Latino Barometer are also closely echoed in the LAPOP survey produced by Vanderbilt University in the United States. Therefore, I think that the question of democratic legitimacy is something that's not quite so rooted. In particular, I think many people take a dim view of the way in political elites and the extent to which they really represent them and work in their own interest. Political parties in Latin America are much criticized. These are, I think, I've argued in the past at least, are a core institution of a functioning democracy, inasmuch as that they perform this function of linking society and the state, providing a representational linkage there. Clearly, and the point that Michael makes about the middle sectors is important here. As we build institutions, the effect of articulate middle-class demands on state institutions is terribly important. And I think this is something that I would certainly echo the kind of comments he was making, that as Latin American societies become more urbanized, as income levels increase, these growing middle sectors have an important impact on the way in which institutions work. They expect institutions to work better than they have in the past. But clearly, it's, the criticism of the workings of democratic institutions is not limited to Latin America or even indeed the developing world. But I would argue that in many countries, at least, the linkages between the state and society are deficient, and that therefore the role of representative democracy is not as strong as it could or possibly should be. There are major defects in the way in which some democratic institutions work, partly because of the influence of certain elite groups, economic groups, and Michael has pointed to the problem of monopolization, and those monopolies obviously exert a great deal of power over the way in which sometimes democratic institutions work. There is, secondly, the problem of the prevalence of corruption in public life, in which public decisions are subverted to private interests by dishonest means. And thirdly, there is the power of organized crime to influence governmental decisions in one way or another, whether at the national, the regional, or the local level, particularly in those of drug trafficking organizations. Mexico and Central America stand out here, but drug interests are influential actors throughout the Latin American region. This, therefore, I think points to the question of the quality of government, or to use the World Bank jargon, good governance, and the need to progressively enhance the functioning of democratic institutions in such a way as to embed them more in a rooted sense in society, to improve the way they work, to rebuild public confidence in them, and, in short, to augment the legitimacy in the eyes of ordinary citizens. And quite a lot has been, I mean, I would be first to say that quite a lot has been achieved in the last 20 years in this respect, both by governments, by international organizations and financial organizations, and by private sector organizations, including them amongst these non-governmental organizations of one kind or another. But there have been a lot, I think, of countervailing pressures. It's not just a question of unilinear progress, and I think there's still much more to do. So what sort of things can be done? The list here is quite extensive, and I'll just mention just a few things, many of which are part and parcel of the policy package in many countries. Firstly, there are electoral reforms and legislation regarding the workings of parties. There's plenty of experience to learn from here. International IDEA, for example, is an organization at the international level which has codified many of these practices of how to pursue institutional reform in this particular sphere, producing codes of good practice. But ultimately, electoral rules need to correspond to established practices in individual countries and reflect the local traditions and the way of doing things. Secondly, there's decentralization and enhanced local participation. Again, there's been much done in Latin America in the last 2 decades in this respect. Many countries which were traditionally very centralized in the way they operate have moved in the direction of decentralization. This, of course, has created problems. It's not a simple matter simply to decentralize power and authority to local authorities when there is a notable absence of such authorities, or the probity of certain local authorities is in question. But there has been some achievement here, and I think that this is, again, an area which is worthy of study and worthy of being perfected. More controversially, I think there are issues concerning the introduction of what's been called direct democracy. I think that, though controversial, these measures can serve to back up the institutions of representative democracy. Both can, to a certain extent, work in tandem. There can be the use of recall referenda, for example, to get rid of inoperative local or national authorities, referenda on local and indeed national issues of importance to people, despite the obvious possibilities of such things being manipulated through the questions that are asked. This does provide a way in which ordinary people can begin to engage more actively in political debate. Then there's the question of judicial reforms. This has been a problem area, I think, in many Latin American countries. Many judiciaries have proved very difficult to reform, and the workings of the judiciary are very often opaque, difficult to penetrate, difficult to access on the part of ordinary people, and it has to be said, in many countries the judiciary is very susceptible to corruption. But there is some practice here which can be studied. There is, of course, important things to be done, but it's very important, I think, in terms of reaffirming people's faith in democratic institutions, if they realize that they do have judicial remedies to meet their particular problems which they confront. And then finally, there are specific types of institutions by which complaints can be registered and issues can be followed up. And I'm thinking here particularly of the experience of the ombudsman in Latin America. These now exist in most countries of the region, for all countries of the region, and they have actually performed a very useful role in providing ways in which ordinary citizens can register complaints with an organization, and not only do that, but also these are organizations which can codify those complaints and represent and turn them into policies of reform. Now, of course, there are problems. There's a problem of overload. The complaints are fairly abundant. There is the problem of the level of autonomy that such organizations can command, and whether or not they can remain critical outsiders when they are actually themselves form part of the state. So from the experience of Latin America in the last 2 decades, I think there are perhaps 3 possible conclusions. None of these reforms on their own provide a panacea. Secondly, to work, institutional reform requires good design, and a design which has to be rooted in the country's institutional traditions. They require dynamic leadership. And they also require a body of public opinion to make them happen. These things are not simply questions of top-down impositions. They have to come from the bottom up. And thirdly, there's the question, I think, that off-the-peg solutions do not generally work, and the one-size-fits-all mentality generally leads to failure. These are reforms that have to stem from an understanding of how institutions have worked in the past in specific realities. Now, moving from here to looking at institutions as they affect investors, Latin America, as we've seen, has had something of a revival in terms of resource nationalism in the past few years, in part in some countries as a result of responses to high commodity prices and the interest of countries to cash in, at least in part, on those prices. And perhaps more importantly, the reaction against some of the disappointments generated by the post-debt crisis economic liberalization associated with the Washington Consensus. The history of resource nationalism in Latin America, of course, it goes back a long way, at least until the 1930s. It's probably more ingrained in the sort of historical mentality in Latin America than many other parts of the developing world. This has been much more evident in some countries than others. I mean, Michael has mentioned some of them. Venezuela, Bolivia, Argentina, Ecuador stand out in South America in challenging existing business contracts, entering into forcible renegotiations of other contracts, and in some cases going down the road of outright renationalization. And there are countries whose governments have sought to promote investment, but where important sectors of society have been very resolutely opposed to certain cases of foreign investment. And I'm thinking here in particular of Peru, where there have been a lot of opposition to the extractive industries that have invested in the country in recent years. So what are the reasons why economic nationalism has gained salience in these countries? Well, firstly is the failure of economic liberalization in many cases to produce the promised benefits, in particular in terms of employment. Many of these policies, when they were first in place, were rather oversold in terms of the benefits that they would accrue, and there was a certain amount of disappointment at some of the results. Linked to that, there are large proportions in many countries of the population, many countries of the region, where the population didn't actually gain an awful lot, but certain sectors did, and social inequalities possibly increased. In many cases, policies were over-identified with those of foreign institutions and outside interests of one kind or another. Many cases also there were perceptions of corruption and kickbacks associated with investment contracts. There was distrust in the way regulatory and other institutions handle such problems, and a broader distrust in the way that representative institutions represent citizens' interests in dealing with some of these problems. And of course there were the emergence of new leaderships and new political movements. But this has not been the whole story for Latin America by any means. Many countries have continued to promote investor-friendly policies, albeit mitigated by the need to attend to countervailing pressures. The cases of Brazil under Cardoso and Lula, Mexico under Fox and Calderón, and indeed, starting of course with Salinas and Zedillo, Colombia under Uribe and Santos, Chile under the governments of the Concertación and more recently under Piñera, and Peru under Fujimori, Toledo and Alan Garcia. We wait to see quite how policy will evolve in Peru under Ollanta Humala. Underlying this is the fact that with some exceptions, these are the countries where institutions work reasonably well, reflect a diversity of interests, and have a fairly long track record of operation. There are, of course, forces within each country which object to the terms under which investors operate, but they're not, except possibly with the recent case of Peru, electorally dominant. So what can be done to strengthen institutions in such a way as to protect foreign investment? Well, clearly the question of transparency of contractual obligations is important, particularly with regard to taxation. so that business deals are not cloaked within a mystery, cloaked in an aura of mystery in the way in which they are likely to excite criticism or suspicion in certain quarters. The EITI perhaps provides an important guide as to how this may work. Secondly, and related to that, is the question of accountability to the wider society beyond just conventional reporting, accountability to elected bodies, national, regional, and local, with powers of oversight that go beyond the minimum possible levels of public accountability. Closely connected to this is the question of, let's say, proper regulation. We've heard this morning, and indeed what Michael was saying, quite a lot of criticisms of the way of over-regulation in Latin America by a number of governments. I think here the question is the question of striking the right balance between the interests of foreign investors and consumers or other stakeholders in their operations. Striking that balance has proved politically problematic in many Latin American countries, leading to perceptions of capture by regulators, by the regulated, or even indeed collusion in that sphere. So I think that it's not a question of necessarily more regulation, but it's a question of better regulation. Then there's the question of how to represent the interests of stakeholders in the processes of decision-making, including here producers, workers, consumers, and other interested third parties like peasant communities, if you like. How to create fluid mechanisms of such participation. This is eminently complicated in some circumstances, and it's obviously difficult in many to build trust. And this element of trust, I think, is absolutely critical. So what we need to do in terms of policy more broadly is how to build trust in investment amongst large sectors of the population. Within this case, when a particular example of here is, and it's been an issue in Peru recently, and it's also been particularly an issue in Brazil, as we heard this morning, is the question of prior consultation of those people whose interests are affected by investment projects or infrastructure projects of one kind or another. There needs to be tangible evidence of sharing in the benefits of investment, going beyond the traditional philanthropy or even corporate social responsibility. And this, I think, implies a new level of collaboration and cooperation between public and private sectors. And finally, and this is more obviously much easier said than done, is tackling the need to tackle corruption or perceptions of it. And I think this requires a more affirmative approach on the part of the state, particularly from the judicial authorities. So in short, and to wind up, what's needed, I think, is the consolidation of what you might call a democratic state. A democratic state not just in electoral terms, but in terms of the way in which the state represents divergent interest groups within the state, and which ultimately affect the decisions that are taken by the state. It's important, I think, therefore, behind this is the rebuilding of public legitimacy, public faith, where state decisions are made that reflect not just sectional or even corporate interests. You will inevitably find people disenchanted and looking for alternative systems. This, at least, I think, is the conclusion of the study which I've been involved in recently, looking at the role of extractive industries in the Andean countries, in particular Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and the way in which the need to create a greater degree of engagement between different sectors of the population, different interest groups within the body of the state. And I think this, in a sense, is the next step towards the creation of a democratic state. So, thanks very much.